I find the problem of suffering and evil the most difficult problem that I face. And indeed, I think that is also true for my atheist friends. It is an immensely difficult problem. And I suppose we can focus on the famous statement of David Hume, who, reflecting on this problem, he said this: Epicurus's old questions are yet unanswered. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then is he impotent? Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent? Is he both able and willing? Whence then this evil? That's a very famous statement of the problem of evil, coming from the ancient world, coming from the philosopher Epicurus, who decided, partly because of this problem, that this universe is all that there exists. There is no transcendence. There are no gods. There is no God. And so today in the academy we find Epicurus's philosophy, which we now call naturalism, dominant in the academy. And many of my colleagues at Oxford will say to me quietly, please don't talk to me about a personal God. How can there be a God when this world is in such a mess? How can there be a God when my world is in such a mess? So, as sensitively as I can, I'm going to not, ladies and gentlemen, insult you by offering you simplistic panaceas, answers to this question. What I'm going to try to do is to share with you what I found helpful as a way into this that can begin to make some sense. Now, of course, there are two distinct problems we're dealing with. First of all, there is the problem of moral evil. That is the evil that people do to one another. And then there is what's often called the problem of pain, where people aren't necessarily involved, the catastrophes that occur, earthquakes, tsunamis, lightning strikes, meteorite strikes, and so on. These two problems form what is often called the problem of evil. But then there are two ways of looking at both of these problems that are very different. An oncologist sees cancer in a very different way from the patient who's just been told she has 6 months to live. The question of suffering and evil will look very different if you're a spectator theoretically trying to analyze the problem, or if you're a person who's participating at this moment in deep and hard to understand suffering. So there are two perspectives. There's an intellectual side to our question, and there's a pastoral side. People's hearts are breaking. I remember when my sister telephoned me and told me that her lovely daughter of 22, just married, had a brain tumor, an earthquake in the brain. What do you say? I didn't have an earthquake in my brain, so I had to face the question theoretically. She had to face it, and the pain that it involved. It's hard. And part of the difficulty in handling it is that I know in an audience like this, our experience of suffering is vast. We observe it, but we maybe have experienced in our own lives and the way we've been treated by our parents, maybe even. And so I shall try as best I can, I shall fail, but I shall try as best I can to be sensitive to it. I remember years ago, and it's happened many times, but this is typical. I was in a country far away, and I was having breakfast with two Jewish friends from Israel. They were brilliant engineers. And we started to talk, and the question of God came up, and I said to them, "How do you stand?" And they said, "We don't believe in God." And I said, "That's odd, because part of my reason for believing in God is your history." Well, they said, "We don't actually believe in God." And I said, "Would you tell me why?" And I remember the man saying, he said, "No, I don't want to tell you why." Well, I said, "That's all right." So we went on talking, and I could see husband and wife, them looking at each other, and they came to a decision, and he suddenly said, "We're going to tell you why." But he said, "Don't blame me if it destroys your faith." And I said, "Well," you know, my faith in God is evidence-based. If it's destroyed by what you say, it wasn't worth having in the first place. So he said, "All right." He said, "My wife and I love literature. We read books to each other. We were reading a book by Bashevis Singer, the brilliant Israeli Nobel laureate for literature. He wrote a book called The Slave. And he said, we were reading this book one evening, and we came across a passage where Singer described a horrific event in Russia where Jewish women and children were buried alive. And I'll never forget this man. With pain in his eyes, he said to me, in that moment the light went out. And we've never believed in God since. So what do you say? He was looking at it theoretically, but of course I knew he'd lost so many of his relatives in the Holocaust. And I've been in Auschwitz many times, ladies and gentlemen, and I've wept every time. That's one example of moral evil that could be multiplied, of course. So I said to them, all right then, there's no God. And they looked at me strangely and they said, we thought you believed in God. I said, yes, I do, but you seem to have solved the problem. There is no God. That is just the way the universe is. And I couldn't help thinking of Richard Dawkins when he talks about the ultimate nature of reality in this direction. And when he says this universe is just as you would expect it to be. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it or any justice. The universe we observe, writes Dawkins, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. And we dance to its music. I've mentioned that to Richard Dawkins publicly several times. He's never retracted it. And ladies and gentlemen, we need to face this analysis because it is increasingly prevalent in the academy. Listen carefully to what it says. There is no good, there is no evil. But half a minute. Do I hear Richard Dawkins complaining that God is evil? I do. But if there's no good and no evil, that is a meaningless statement. Now this is enormously important. I know it's theoretical, but it is important. The logical consequence of Dawkins' attitude is to abolish the categories of good and evil. But if you do that, ladies and gentlemen, it's idle to talk about God being evil or the world being evil because there isn't any good or evil. Now the reason, of course, that Dawkins still talks about evil is that he discovers, as you and I discover, all of us, that we are moral beings. whether we believe in God or not. We've got a sensitivity to right and wrong, to good and bad, to justice and injustice, and therefore, whether we are an atheist or not, we look at Auschwitz and we say it's evil. Yes? But that's beginning to make a hole in naturalism. Because if the logical consequence of believing there is no God is to abolish the categories of good and evil, then the logical consequence of admitting that these categories exist is to reintroduce the possibility that there is a God with all the problems that that brings with it.